The corridor stretched into shadow lit only by the flicker of gas lamps that hissed and sputtered against the dampness. The walls were thick stone built to contain more than bodies, built to silence screams that the respectable world beyond could not bear to hear. A woman in a stained nightdress pressed her face against the bars of a cell door. Her fingers curled around the iron like roots seeking soil. She had been a governess once, before the melancholia took her, before her husband signed the papers, before the carriage came in the night. Somewhere deeper in the asylum, water dripped with the persistence of a metronome. Footsteps echoed, the measured tread of an attendant making his rounds. Keys jangled at his belt. In the wards, patients rocked and muttered, their words dissolving into the thick air. Some had been here for months, others for decades. The records were imprecise, the reasons for commitment more so. Hysteria, moral insanity, religious enthusiasm, masturbation, disobedience. The physician who ran this place called it treatment. He called it science. He spoke of the humane management of the insane, of moral therapy and the cultivation of reason through discipline. But the leather restraints hanging from the wall told a different story. The ice baths, the spinning chairs, the isolation cells where time ceased to have meaning. This is the story of how Victorian England locked away its inconvenient souls and called it mercy. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Containment. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small around you. Wherever you are listening from, whether in the stillness of your room, or somewhere beneath blankets as the day releases its grip, thank you for joining me here in this imminent hour. What time is it where you are? Is the darkness complete, or does some light still linger at your window? Before we begin our journey into the shadows of the past, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so that we may continue to meet in these hushed moments when history speaks most clearly to those willing to listen. Tonight, we descend into the world of the Victorian Asylum. We shall walk its corridors, observe its routines, and bear witness to the lives lived behind walls that society built to contain what it could not comprehend. Let us drift backward now to the England of gaslight and empire, where madness wore 1,000 faces and mercy took the shape of stone. The first asylums rose from the earth like cathedrals of a new faith. In the early decades of the 19th century, England looked upon its insane with fresh eyes, and what it saw disturbed the conscience of reformers and physicians alike. The old way had been simple and brutal. Mad folk had been kept in cellars, chained in attics, confined to poorhouse wards where they languished among the sick and criminal. Private madhouses operated in shadow, their practices unregulated, their mortality rates unrecorded. Families paid to have troublesome relations vanish. The insane wandered streets, objects of mockery or fear. No systematic approach existed. No philosophy of care, only containment, crude and expedient. Then came the reformers, armed with Enlightenment ideals and humanitarian zeal. They spoke of moral treatment, a concept imported from France, where Philippe Pinel had struck the chains from asylum patients and proclaimed that madness could be cured through kindness, routine, and the restoration of reason. In England, the Quaker William Tuke established the York Retreat in 1796, a country house where the insane lived without restraints, working in gardens, taking meals together, treated as human beings temporarily estranged from their faculties. The experiment appeared to succeed. Visitors marvelled. The notion spread that asylums need not be dungeons, but could be therapeutic institutions, places of healing rather than mere custody. Parliament took notice. In 1845, the Lunacy Act compelled every county in England and Wales to provide asylum accommodation for pauper lunatics. The state had decided that madness was a public responsibility, a medical condition requiring specialised treatment in purpose-built institutions. The asylum would be both hospital and sanctuary, removing the insane from environments that had driven them mad while providing the structure necessary for their cure. It was a vision born of genuine compassion, a belief that science and civilization could ameliorate suffering that previous ages had simply endured. And so they built. Across the countryside, on hillsides and rural estates far from city centres, the asylums rose. They were vast structures, designed according to architectural principles that reflected contemporary theories of mental illness. The corridor plan dominated, long wings radiating from a central administrative block, allowing classification of patients by type and severity of affliction. Wards could be segregated, the violent separated from the melancholic, the acute from the chronic, the curable from those beyond hope, separate galleries for men and women, airing courts where patients could take exercise without escaping into the wider world. The building spoke a language of institutional benevolence. Red brick facades stretched hundreds of feet. Tall windows admitted light and air. For the alienists, as asylum physicians were known, believed that darkness and poor ventilation contributed to mental decay. High ceilings, wide corridors, day rooms furnished with tables and chairs, libraries stocked with improving literature, chapels for religious observance, workrooms where patients could engage in productive labour, the men at carpentry or gardening, the women at sewing and laundry. Every element designed to impose order upon disordered minds, to recreate within the asylum walls a miniature society governed by reason and routine. Yet the architecture contained contradictions. The same buildings that promised liberation through treatment were fortresses. Walls surrounded the grounds, 10 or 12 feet high, topped with iron spikes or broken glass. Gates locked, windows barred on the lower floors. Doors throughout the interior fitted with locks that only attendants carried keys to open. The asylum was an island, severed from the world, its inhabitants neither citizens nor prisoners but something in between, patients whose liberty had been suspended for their own good and the safety of others. The location of asylums reinforced their separateness. They stood on the edges of towns, or in open country where land was cheap and neighbours few. The journey to visit a confined relative required deliberate effort. Omnibuses did not pass their gates. The walk from the nearest railway station might consume an hour. This distance was intentional, conceived as therapeutic, removing the mad from the stimulation and stress of urban life, but it also served to render the asylum invisible. Out of sight, the insane troubled no one. Their suffering became abstract, their existence theoretical to the respectable families who might pass the asylum grounds and think of it, if at all, as a necessary institution serving purposes they need not examine closely. Inside, the spatial organisation of the asylum created hierarchies. The administrative offices occupied the central block, where the medical superintendent maintained his residence and conducted the business of the institution. Reception rooms for visitors, offices for clerks who managed the endless paperwork that tracked admissions, discharges, deaths. The superintendent's authority radiated outward through the wings, enforced by a staff of attendants who lived on site, sleeping in small rooms near the wards they supervised. Kitchens and laundries and workshops hummed in basement levels. The asylum was a self-contained world, a vast machine designed to process madness into sanity through the application of routine and discipline. But the machine required bodies to function. The demand for asylum beds exceeded every projection. The 1845 Act had anticipated modest institutions housing 200 or 300 patients. Within a decade, asylums sheltered 500, then 800. New wings were added, buildings expanded. The original therapeutic vision, so small communities where each patient received individual attention, dissolved beneath the pressure of numbers. Attendants found themselves responsible for 30 or 40 patients per shift. Physicians saw wards crowded with faces they could not distinguish, cases they had no time to study. The asylum became a warehouse, its architecture of hope repurposed for mere containment. The aesthetic of these places embodied Victorian contradiction. From the exterior, they resembled country estates or civic monuments, their proportions dignified, their materials solid. Visitors approaching for the first time might mistake them for schools or manor houses. Only upon closer inspection did the prison elements reveal themselves. The bars, the locks, the airing courts enclosed by walls. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. Corridors stretched into dimness despite the tall windows. The smell was institutional, a mixture of carbolic soap, boiled food, unwashed bodies, and damp stone. Paint peeled from walls. Floors wore down beneath the shuffle of countless feet. The gas lamps that illuminated evening hours cast shadows that moved and flickered, giving the wards an uneasy quality, as if the building itself were restless. Patients learned the geography of confinement quickly. The ward became the limit of their world. A long room lined with beds, each separated by a small cabinet for personal possessions, though few patients retained such things. Windows they could not open, doors they could not pass without permission. The day room where they sat during waking hours, staring at walls or at one another, waiting for meals or the brief exercise period in the airing court. Some wards featured single rooms, cells really, measuring 8 feet by 6, containing a bed bolted to the floor and nothing else. These were for the violent, the suicidal, those requiring isolation. Patients confined to such rooms lost track of time. Day and night became indistinguishable. The only human contact came when attendants opened the door to deliver food or empty the chamber pot. The asylum's physical structure encoded assumptions about madness and its treatment. The architecture presumed that insanity arose from disorder, moral, physical, environmental. Therefore, cure required the imposition of absolute order. Patients woke at fixed hours, ate at fixed times, worked according to rigid schedules. Bells regulated the day. Attendants enforced compliance. The building itself became an instrument of therapy, its routines designed to reprogram minds that had slipped from reason. Alienists spoke of the asylum as a great moral machine, and indeed it was mechanical, inflexible, impersonal, grinding forward regardless of individual need or suffering. Yet who determined what constituted order? What defined reason? The asylum authorities, almost exclusively men of the professional and middle classes, carried their assumptions about proper behaviour, proper thought, proper emotion into the wards. They saw madness in deviation from social norms. Women who spoke too freely, who defied husbands, who expressed sexual desire. These became candidates for diagnosis and confinement. Men who drank excessively, who gambled, who failed in business through what was judged moral weakness rather than misfortune. These too filled the asylum wards. The architecture of containment housed not merely the mad, but the inconvenient, the embarrassing, the socially disruptive. The asylums multiplied. By mid-century, nearly every county possessed one. Some regions built several. Colney Hatch in Middlesex opened in 1851 to house 2,000 patients, the largest asylum in Europe, a city unto itself with its own bakery, brewery, farm and gasworks. The building stretched 1/3 of a mile. Its corridors required attendants 10 minutes to traverse end to end. Patients arriving there must have felt they had entered not a hospital, but a metropolis of the mad, a place so vast that individual identity would surely dissolve into the mass of suffering humanity warehoused within its walls. And still they filled. The census of lunacy grew year by year. In 1850, England and Wales confined 27,000 certified lunatics in asylums. By 1870, the number had doubled. By 1900, it exceeded 100,000. The asylum system designed to cure had become permanent. The institutions built for temporary therapeutic intervention transformed into lifetime custodial facilities. Patients admitted in their 20s remained until death claimed them in their 70s. The architecture intended to facilitate healing became familiar as home, the only home many would ever know again. The reformers had imagined asylums as places of light, but they had built labyrinths. The corridors branched and turned, locked doors multiplied. The distance between the world outside and the wards inside measured more than physical space. It was a gulf in understanding, in compassion, in memory. Those who passed through the asylum gates found themselves in a realm operating by different laws, where their protests would be interpreted as symptoms, their distress as proof of illness, their desire for freedom as evidence they required continued confinement. The architecture of containment was complete, the stage was set, and upon it, human dramas of suffering and cruelty, hope and despair would unfold for decades, largely unseen by the society that had commissioned these great stone monuments to its own civilized conscience. Chapter 2: The Catalogue of Madness. The physicians who governed the asylums were architects of a different sort. They built taxonomies, elaborate systems of classification that divided madness into categories, subtypes, gradations of severity. The human mind in its distress became subject matter for a new science, one that sought to impose medical authority over what had previously been the domain of clergymen, philosophers, and common prejudice. These men called themselves alienists, specialists in diseases of alienation, and they believed that madness could be understood, catalogued, and ultimately cured through rational observation and systematic treatment. The diagnostic categories multiplied as the century progressed. In the early decades, asylum records listed patients simply as lunatic or idiot, terms broad and undefined. But as the profession of alienism matured, as journals were founded and conferences held, the nomenclature expanded. Mania and melancholia formed the primary division, the one characterized by excitement and violence, the other by depression and withdrawal. Within these broad types, subspecies proliferated: religious mania, puerperal mania, delusional insanity, monomania, a condition where the patient appeared rational except on a single subject that had become object of fixation, moral insanity, a diagnosis reserved for those whose behaviour violated social norms without apparent disorder of intellect. The categories were not neutral. They encoded the values and assumptions of Victorian society, its anxieties and prejudices given medical legitimacy. Consider the diagnosis of hysteria, applied almost exclusively to women, attributed to disturbances of the womb. Symptoms included emotional excess, nervous excitability, fainting, inappropriate laughter or tears, complaints of pains for which no physical cause could be identified. A woman who defied her husband, who expressed dissatisfaction with domestic confinement, who exhibited sexual desire beyond what was considered proper, she risked being labelled hysterical, her discontent reframed as illness requiring treatment. The asylum records overflow with cases of hysteria, hundreds of women confined because they had become inconvenient, because their families lacked the means or inclination to manage them at home. Men faced their own diagnostic traps. Moral insanity, a concept developed by the physician James Cowles Pritchard in 1835, described individuals whose capacity for moral judgment had become impaired without obvious intellectual defect. They might be intelligent, articulate, capable of reasoning, yet prone to criminal behaviour, sexual excess, drunkenness, violence. The diagnosis allowed asylum confinement of those who might otherwise be sent to prison. It also pathologized poverty. A man who failed to provide for his family, who drank his wages, who wandered unemployed. Such a man might be deemed morally insane, his poverty recast as mental illness, his admission to the asylum presented as humanitarian intervention. The certificates required for asylum admission demanded specificity. 2 medical practitioners had to examine the patient and attest to the presence of insanity, describing particular facts indicating its existence. The forms contained blank spaces to be filled, yet the facts recorded were often trivial, subjective, circular. A woman was deemed insane because she would not eat, spoke of visions, wept constantly. A man was certified because he threatened violence, destroyed property, could not sleep. But what had caused these behaviours? What circumstances preceded the crisis? The certificates rarely inquired. The immediate symptom sufficed. The context was irrelevant. Grief became pathological when it exceeded acceptable duration. A widow who mourned her husband past the conventional period risked diagnosis of melancholia. A mother who could not recover from the death of a child might be admitted to the asylum, her sorrow reframed as mental disease. The alienists drew firm boundaries around proper emotion. To feel too much, to feel too long, to express feeling in ways that disturbed others. These were indicators of a mind unhinged. The asylum would restore equilibrium, tempering excessive emotion through routine and restraint until the patient achieved the flat effect that passed for sanity. Religious enthusiasm constituted grounds for confinement. The 19th century was an age of revival movements, of prophets and preachers stirring crowds to fervour. Individuals convinced of divine communication, who heard voices commanding them to testify, who spent hours in prayer or fell into ecstatic trances. These presented problems for a society that valued religious observance but mistrusted excess. The line between piety and mania was drawn by physicians who often conflated intensity of belief with mental instability. Asylum records contain numerous cases of patients admitted for religious delusions, their faith judged pathological by authorities who themselves attended church weekly and professed Christian conviction. Masturbation was considered both sin and sickness, a practice that alienists believed led directly to insanity. Medical texts warned of the degenerative effects of self-abuse, nervous exhaustion, weakness of intellect, eventual madness. Young men discovered in the act might be committed to asylums, subjected to treatments designed to curb their urges. The obsession with sexual purity extended to women as well. A diagnosis of nymphomania could be applied to any expression of female sexuality deemed inappropriate. Women who spoke openly of desire, who engaged in affairs, who failed to submit dutifully to their husbands. The asylum offered a solution, removing them from society and subjecting them to regimens intended to extinguish improper passion. The asylum census reflected social sorting as much as a medical diagnosis. The pauper lunatic, supported by parish funds, admitted under the 1845 Act, filled the majority of beds. These were individuals without family resources, without advocates, swept into the asylum system by overseers of the poor eager to shift the burden of their care from workhouse to institution. Their diagnoses were often vague, their prospects for discharge negligible. They became permanent charges of the state, their madness chronic because no one outside the asylum walls retained interest in their fate. The private patient, supported by family payment, occupied better wards, received more attention from physicians and stood greater chance of discharge. Money purchased privacy, individual rooms rather than crowded dormitories, better food, the possibility that one's case might be reviewed regularly. The asylum system maintained this class distinction rigorously. Even within institutions designed to warehouse the poor, accommodations varied. The charitable cases in decent wards, the paupers in the worst, the criminal lunatics, those transferred from prisons, locked in separate wings, their status marking them as both mad and dangerous. Children entered asylums. The age of admission ran low in some institutions, accepting patients as young as 7 or 8 years. A child deemed idiotic, unable to learn or be trained, might be committed. Epileptic children subject to fits that frightened families found themselves in asylum wards. Orphans whose behaviour presented management problems, asylums accepted them too. The theory held that early intervention might prevent chronic insanity, that the plastic young mind could be moulded back to reason more easily than the fixed adult. In practice, children committed to asylums rarely left. They grew to adulthood within the institution, their entire lives shaped by ward routine. Their identity formed in corridors and airing courts, knowing no other existence. The elderly mad posed particular problems. Senile dementia, as it was termed, affected those whose minds had deteriorated with age. Families unable to provide care sought asylum admission. The asylums filled with aged patients, confused and incontinent, requiring constant supervision. They would not recover. The alienists knew this. Yet the beds they occupied reduced space for acute cases that might benefit from treatment. The asylum transformed into a geriatric ward, its therapeutic mission lost beneath the practical necessities of managing bodies that had outlived their minds. The diagnosis of general paralysis of the insane described the final stage of syphilis, though this connection was not fully understood until the early 20th century. Patients with general paralysis exhibited progressive deterioration, weakness, tremors, delusions of grandeur followed by dementia and death. They filled asylum wards beyond cure, their condition degenerative and terminal. The alienists could offer no treatment, only containment, observation of the disease's predictable course. These patients became case studies, their decline documented in medical journals, their suffering contributing to the accumulation of knowledge even as they received no benefit from it. The insane following childbirth, puerperal mania, arrived in asylum wards with disturbing frequency. Women who had given birth and descended into madness within days or weeks. Some heard voices commanding them to harm their infants. Others fell into profound depression or exhibited wild excitement. The condition was real, its causes obscure. Physicians attributed it to the shock of childbirth, the sudden hormonal changes, constitutional weakness. Treatment consisted of separation from the child, rest, sedation. Some recovered, others did not. The asylum separated mother from infant permanently, the child sent to family or foundling home, the mother remaining confined until she either regained sanity or was transferred to the chronic wards. Epilepsy and insanity were conflated. Patients subject to seizures often exhibited behavioral changes, irritability, violence, confusion. Asylums accepted epileptics, housing them in separate wards where they could be observed during fits. The condition carried stigma, association with moral failing or hereditary taint. Families sought asylum admission not because the seizures themselves required institutional care, but because the social embarrassment of an epileptic relative proved intolerable. The asylum provided convenient disappearance, medical justification for what amounted to permanent exile. The catalogue of madness expanded to accommodate every form of deviance, distress, and difficulty. Suicidal tendency, admission. Homicidal impulse, admission. Excessive drinking, admission, if accompanied by any behavioural irregularity. Poverty combined with odd behaviour, admission. Old age and confusion, admission. The asylum became repository for all whom society found troublesome. Its medical authority deployed to justify confinement that served social convenience as much as therapeutic purpose. The alienists genuinely believed they were practicing science. They measured skulls, seeking physical correlates of mental disease. They recorded case histories with meticulous attention to symptoms and progression. They published treatises on classification and treatment. Yet their categories were built on sand. Their diagnostic criteria shaped by cultural bias and theoretical assumption rather than empirical foundation. What they called illness was often simply different, suffering, reasonable response to unbearable circumstance. The catalogue of madness was as much a catalogue of social control, a medical vocabulary deployed to pathologize and confine those who did not or could not conform. And once diagnosed, once certified and admitted, the patient entered a world where protest reinforced the label of insanity. To insist on one's sanity became symptom of lack of insight. To demand release became evidence of ongoing illness. The diagnosis itself created the reality it claimed to describe, trapping individuals in a circular logic from which escape proved nearly impossible. The catalogue had been compiled, the categories established, and into them tens of thousands would be sorted, their lives reduced to entries in asylum ledgers, their suffering transmuted into data points in the science of alienism. Chapter 3. The admission. The process began with a letter, or a knock upon a door, or a quiet conversation between family members in a parlour while the subject of their discussion sat unaware in another room. Someone had determined that the situation could no longer continue. A wife's melancholy had persisted too long. A son's drinking and violence endangered the household. A daughter's nervous excitability had become scandal. An elderly parent's confusion had progressed beyond the family's capacity to manage. The decision was made. The asylum was the solution. The law required paperwork. A petition from a relative or friend, stating relationship to the patient and reasons for seeking confinement. 2 medical certificates, each signed by a qualified practitioner who had examined the patient within 7 days, each containing specific observations indicating insanity. A reception order from a justice of the peace or poor law official authorising admission. The forms protected against wrongful confinement, at least in theory. They created a paper trail documentation that could be reviewed. They ensured that no one could be locked away without formal legal process. In practice, the requirements were easily satisfied. Physicians who specialised in signing lunacy certificates operated in most towns, willing to conduct cursory examinations for a fee. A family's regular doctor might be persuaded to sign, particularly if the patient was poor and the family desperate. The facts indicating insanity could be vague, subjective, exaggerated. The examining physicians need not probe deeply. Their role was to confirm what the family had already determined, to provide medical legitimacy to a decision driven by family dynamics, financial pressure, social embarrassment, or genuine concern for the patient's welfare. The patient often learned of the plan only when implementation was underway. Some received no warning at all. They might be told they were travelling to visit relatives, or consulting a physician about their nerves, or taking a rest cure in the country. The deception was considered merciful, avoiding distress and potential resistance. A carriage arrived at the house, sometimes in morning, sometimes late at night. If the patient resisted, attendants from the asylum accompanied the driver. Men experienced in managing violent or reluctant admissions. Restraints might be employed, chloral hydrate or laudanum administered to induce sedation. The journey to the asylum became abduction, however legal the paperwork. The carriage that transported patients to the asylum was unmarked, revealing nothing of its purpose. Inside, curtains covered the windows. The patient sat in dimness, unable to see the route, disoriented by motion and fear. The journey might last hours if the asylum lay in distant countryside. No one explained what was happening. Questions were met with silence or empty reassurance. The patient's protests were interpreted as symptoms, confirmation that confinement was necessary. By the time the carriage passed through the asylum gates, rolling up the long drive toward the main building, the patient had entered a state of dread and confusion that would be recorded in the admission notes as agitation or acute distress. The reception process was institutional and impersonal. The carriage stopped before the administrative entrance. Attendants led the patient into a waiting room with bare walls and wooden benches. The paperwork was verified. A clerk recorded the patient's name, age, marital status, occupation, religion, previous place of residence. The medical superintendent or his assistant conducted a brief examination, noting physical condition, behaviour, speech patterns. The patient's clothing and personal possessions were inventoried and removed. Asylum dress was issued, shapeless garments of coarse fabric identical to what every other patient wore. The transformation from individual to inmate was swift and thorough. The patient was bathed, the process clinical and humiliating. Water cold or lukewarm, hard soap that stripped the skin, attendants who scrubbed with brisk efficiency, indifferent to modesty or distress. Hair was checked for vermin, sometimes cut short regardless of the patient's wishes. For women, long hair might be preserved, braided and pinned severely. For men, a standard shortcut was imposed. The body itself was inspected, searched for hidden objects or signs of injury. Bruises, scars, marks of self-harm, all were noted in the admission records. Then came assignment to a ward. The medical superintendent made this determination based on diagnosis, behaviour, and available space. The acute wards housed recent admissions, those whose madness was judged temporary and potentially curable. The chronic wards held long-term residents, patients whose recovery was no longer anticipated. Separate wards for the violent, for epileptics, for the demented elderly. The patient was led through corridors, up staircases, through locked doors that closed behind with definitive clicks. Other patients stared or ignored the newcomer. Attendants provided minimal explanation. The ward itself communicated its reality. Rows of beds, barred windows, the smell of carbolic and unwashed bodies, the sounds of weeping or muttering or silence thick with resignation. A bed was assigned, one among dozens in a dormitory ward. A small cabinet beside it for the few personal items patients were permitted to keep. The rules were explained, if at all, in rapid summary. Wake at 6, dress and wash, breakfast at 7, work detail or day room until dinner at noon, exercise period in the airing court, tea at 5, bed at 8, no talking after lights out, obedience to attendants at all times. Violations of rules resulted in punishment. The specifics of punishment were not detailed. They would be learned through observation and perhaps personal experience. The first night in the asylum was endurance. The ward never achieved full darkness. Gas lamps turned low burned through the night, casting enough light for attendants to observe patients during their rounds. Sounds echoed in the high-ceilinged room. Someone wept. Another patient talked to voices only they could hear. Feet shuffled to the nightwater closet. Keys jangled as attendants moved through. The mattress was thin, straw-filled, crackling with every movement. Blankets rough, pillows hard. Sleep came fitfully, if at all. The new patient lay awake, mind circling through disbelief and fear, replaying the events that had led to this place, trying to understand how their life had narrowed to this bed in this room with these strangers who were now their companions in confinement. Morning brought the first full day of asylum routine. The bell rang at 6. Attendants moved through the ward, pulling blankets from those who did not rise immediately. Patients shuffled to the washing room where cold water in tin basins awaited. Limited time to dress. The clothing issued was ill-fitting, too large or too small, designed for utility rather than dignity. Then formation for the walk to breakfast. Single file, no talking. The dining hall was vast, long tables with benches, hundreds of patients filling the space. The noise was considerable. Attendants stood along the walls watching. The food came in institutional quantities. Porridge, bread, weak tea. Eating utensils were counted before and after meals. Knives were not provided. After breakfast, work assignments for those deemed capable. The men might be sent to the asylum farm, to workshops, to maintenance tasks. The women to the laundry, to sewing rooms, to cleaning. This labour was called therapeutic, part of the moral treatment regime, but it served practical purposes. The asylum relied on patient labour to function. Unpaid work reduced operational costs. Patients maintained the institution that confined them, washed the sheets they slept on, grew the food they ate, mended the clothes they wore. Those considered too ill or violent for worky assignments spent their days in the day room, sitting on benches, staring at walls, waiting for the hours to pass. The medical superintendent made ward rounds weekly if patients were fortunate, less frequently in overcrowded institutions. A few minutes per patient, if that. Attendants reported on behaviour. The superintendent made notes in the casebook. Treatment adjustments might be ordered, but the superintendent's primary responsibility was administrative, managing staff, corresponding with relatives, attending to the endless paperwork required by asylum regulations. The patients themselves saw him as a distant authority figure, powerful but inaccessible, more concerned with institutional order than individual suffering. Family visits were permitted, theoretically. In practice, they were rare. The asylum's location discouraged casual visits. The visiting process was formal and supervised. Families might be turned away if the medical superintendent judged that contact would agitate the patient. Some families visited faithfully for months, then less frequently, then not at all. The pattern was common. Out of sight, the patient faded from family consciousness. Other matters demanded attention. The assumption developed that the asylum was handling things, that the patient was receiving care, that nothing more could be done. Years might pass without a visitor. Letters arrived occasionally, but sometimes were withheld if their contents seemed potentially disturbing. The admission marked a threshold. On one side, a life in the world, however, troubled. On the other, existence in the asylum, subject to its rules and routines, its power structures and hierarchies, its peculiar logic that transformed protest into symptom and suffering into diagnosis. The patient who entered the asylum gates could not know how long confinement would last. Days, months, years, decades. Some would leave, recovered or improved, or simply no longer troublesome enough to justify the expense of maintenance. Others would remain until death, their lives absorbed entirely by the institution, their identities lost to the roles they had been assigned in the catalogue of madness. The admission was complete. The person who had been wife or husband, parent or child, worker or wanderer, had become patient, and in that transformation lay a kind of death, a severing from the world, an entry into a realm where time moved differently, and hope became a luxury few could afford. Chapter 4. The Moral Treatment. The philosophy that governed asylum life in the Victorian era bore a name that suggested virtue and humanity. Moral treatment, as conceived by its advocates, represented a revolution in the care of the insane. It rejected the chains and violence of earlier centuries, proposing instead that madness could be addressed through the cultivation of self-control, the imposition of routine, and the creation of an environment that encouraged the return of reason. The asylum would be a therapeutic community, a place where disordered minds could be gently guided back to health through occupation, regularity, and the example of calm authority. This was the theory. The reality that unfolded in the wards bore only passing resemblance to the ideal. The morning bell at 6 o'clock was the first instrument of moral treatment. It announced that the day had begun according to institutional decree, not individual need or inclination. Patients rose because they were commanded to rise. Those who remained in bed faced consequences. Attendants stripped blankets, shouted, sometimes resorted to physical force. The message was immediate and unambiguous. The patient's will was subordinate to the asylum's schedule. Resistance was futile and would be recorded as evidence of ongoing illness, proof that confinement remained necessary. The washing ritual followed with similar rigidity. Cold water in winter and summer alike. Patients queued at basins, scrubbing themselves under the observation of attendants who ensured no one lingered or shirked. Modesty was impossible in the communal washing rooms. Bodies in various states of health and decline were exposed to common view. The elderly struggled with trembling hands to manage soap and towel. The young endured the humiliation in silence or tears. The process was efficient, not comfortable. It cleaned bodies but stripped dignity. Cleanliness became another form of control, enforced rather than chosen. Part of the relentless machinery of routine that ground through each day. Breakfast in the dining hall was consumed in near silence. Rules prohibited conversation during meals. Attendants patrolled between tables, watching for infractions. The food was adequate in quantity but monotonous in variety. Porridge appeared most mornings, sometimes with a portion of bread. Weak tea, barely sweetened. The institutional appetite was for bulk, not nutritional pleasure. Patients ate because hunger compelled them, not because the meal offered any satisfaction beyond the purely functional. Those who refused food were noted in the records. Persistent refusal led to forced feeding, a procedure justified as medical necessity but experienced as violation. After breakfast came the work assignments that formed the core of moral treatment philosophy. The alienists believed that productive labour restored mental health by providing purpose, by engaging the hands and occupying thoughts that might otherwise spiral into delusion or despair. The asylum farm employed dozens of male patients in agricultural tasks. They ploughed fields, tended livestock, harvested crops. The workshop saw others engaged in carpentry, shoemaking, basket weaving. The labour was real. The products of asylum industry sold or used within the institution. Patients worked without wages, their labour considered therapeutic rather than economic, though the asylum budget benefited considerably from their unpaid efforts. For women, work meant domestic service. The laundry consumed the labour of dozens, boiling and scrubbing linens in steaming rooms where the heat was oppressive and the moisture constant. Others sewed in workrooms, mending clothes and linens, producing garments for asylum use. The kitchen required helpers to prepare the institutional meals. Cleaning details maintained the wards and corridors. The work was hard, repetitive, endless. A pile of soiled linens, washed and dried, would be replaced by another pile the next day. Shirts mended would tear again. Floors scrubbed clean would accumulate dirt within hours. The labour had no completion, only continuation, day after day, week after week, as long as the patient remained confined. The alienists recorded in case notes whether patients worked willingly or required encouragement. Willingness to labour was considered a positive sign, evidence that the patient retained connection to reality and social obligation. Refusal to work indicated the opposite, suggesting that the madness ran deep, that recovery remained distant. Yet what appeared in records as refusal might be exhaustion, might be physical illness, might be simple resistance to unpaid forced labour rationalised as treatment. The distinction was rarely explored. The patient who would not work was troublesome, and troublesome patients faced consequences. The day room served as holding area for those not assigned to labour. Here patients sat for hours on wooden benches arranged along walls. Some rocked rhythmically, others stared at nothing with expressions of profound emptiness. A few talked to themselves or to invisible companions. The day room offered no stimulation, no occupation, nothing to engage mind or body. Books existed in theory but were often kept locked away, deemed dangerous or inappropriate. Games or crafts were rare. The alienists believed that idleness contributed to madness, yet they provided nothing to fill the idle hours of those judged too ill or too troublesome for work details. The patients sat and waited for the next bell, the next meal, the next prescribed activity, their days measured in small increments of institutional time. The exercise period in the airing court was brief, perhaps an hour in the afternoon. Patients walked in circles around a courtyard enclosed by high walls. Some walked alone, others in pairs or small groups if talking was permitted. Attendants watched from the perimeter. The exercise was compulsory, considered essential to physical health, but it held no joy. The courtyard was bare, perhaps a few scraggly shrubs, certainly no beauty to observe. The walking was mechanical, purposeless beyond the movement itself. Rain or bitter cold might cancel the exercise period, leaving patients confined to wards for days at a time. In summer, the courtyard baked under sun, offering no shade, and patients shuffled through heat that left them dizzy and desperate for water that attendants doled out sparingly. Meals marked the day's progression. Dinner at noon brought soup or stew, bread, occasionally a bit of meat. Tea at 5 meant more bread, perhaps cheese, more weak tea. The portions were calculated to maintain life without excess. Hunger remained a constant companion for many patients. Some lost weight steadily, their bodies wasting as appetite failed, or as institutional diet proved insufficient. Others, sedentary and fed starch-heavy meals, gained weight, their bodies softening into institutional bulk. The alienists tracked weight in medical records, but rarely adjusted rations. The diet was what it was, designed for economy and ease of preparation, not for the health of individual patients. Evening hours allowed a brief period of relative freedom before bed. Patients might sit in the day room, engage in limited conversation if ward rules permitted. Some wards had pianos, played by patients with musical training, the sound offering brief respite from institutional monotony. Hymn singing occurred in some asylums, religious observance used as tool of moral reformation. The alienists encouraged Christianity, viewing religious faith as stabilizing influence, though they grew alarmed when patients exhibited too much enthusiasm, when faith tipped into what they judged religious mania. The line between proper devotion and pathological obsession was drawn by men who distrusted intensity of any kind. The bell at 8 o'clock commanded sleep. Patients returned to beds, lay down on thin mattresses, pulled rough blankets over themselves. Attendants made rounds through the night, observing their footsteps and the jingle of keys breaking the fragile quiet. Some patients slept the sleep of exhaustion or medication. Others lay awake, minds too active or disturbed for rest. The insomnia was noted but rarely treated. Sleep would come or it would not. The asylum provided the bed, the darkness, the command to rest. The actual experience of rest was the patient's own problem. Sundays brought variation in routine. Religious services were compulsory for those judged capable of attending. Patients filed into the asylum chapel, sat in pews, listened to sermons delivered by visiting clergy, or the asylum chaplain if one was employed. The services were conventional, Church of England in most institutions, with provisions for Catholics and nonconformists where numbers warranted. The religious instruction emphasised duty, obedience, acceptance of suffering as divine will. Patients were to understand their madness as trial, their confinement as opportunity for moral reformation. Those who could not or would not attend services remained in wards under supervision of attendants resentful at missing their own chapel time. Recreation, such as it existed, was limited and controlled. Some asylums organised annual gatherings, festivals at Christmas or summer fetes, where patients might watch entertainments or participate in simple games. These events were presented as evidence of the asylum's humanitarian character, occasions for visiting officials or potential donors to observe the patients in moments of apparent contentment. Photographs might be taken, images of patients in neat rows, faces arranged in expressions that suggested calm and care. The reality was more complex. The events were breaks in routine, yes, but also performances, opportunities for the asylum to display its work to the world beyond its walls. Letters from patients to family or friends were subject to inspection. The medical superintendent reviewed outgoing correspondence, censoring content deemed inappropriate. Letters that complained of treatment, that pleaded for release, that described conditions in unflattering terms. These were withheld, never sent. The patient would not be told. They would write and wait for replies that never came, interpreting the silence as abandonment when in fact their words had never reached their intended recipients. Incoming letters were similarly inspected. Content that might agitate or disturb the patient was removed, or the entire letter withheld. The asylum controlled all communication with the outside world, isolating patients from information and connection that might have challenged institutional authority. Visitors, when they came, met patients in designated rooms under supervision, but conversation was impossible. An attendant sat nearby listening, sometimes recording what was said. The visit was brief, perhaps 15 or 30 minutes. If the patient became emotional, the visit might be terminated immediately. Patients learned to control their behaviour during visits, to appear calm and well even when they were neither, because displays of distress led to visit cancellation and restrictions on future contact. The performance of sanity became necessary, but the performance itself was exhausting and often unconvincing. Families left these visits uncertain, unable to determine whether their relative was improving or whether the asylum was simply teaching them to hide their suffering more effectively. The moral treatment regime demanded constant surveillance. Patients were never alone, never unwatched. Attendants observed from day-room doorways, walked ward corridors at night, accompanied patients to work assignments and exercise periods. Privacy was eliminated. The water closets had no doors or doors that did not latch. Bathing occurred under observation. Dressing and undressing happened in communal spaces. The exposure was continuous and complete. The alienists justified this surveillance as medical necessity, claiming that suicidal or violent patients required constant monitoring. But the surveillance also served to enforce compliance, to ensure that patients internalized the reality that their every action was subject to institutional scrutiny and control. Punishment for rule violations was inevitable and varied. Mild infractions might earn loss of privileges. No exercise period, no visitors, confinement to the ward. More serious violations led to isolation in single rooms, sometimes for days. The violent or persistently troublesome face mechanical restraint, leather cuffs binding wrists to bed frames, canvas straitjackets immobilizing arms across the chest. The cold bath administered as punishment or treatment, depending on the rationale offered, involved immersion in water so cold it shocked the system. Sometimes for extended periods, the alienists recorded these interventions as therapeutic, as necessary steps in managing dangerous patients. The patients experienced them as torture, as violence inflicted by authorities against which they had no defense or appeal. The moral treatment was a machine, and patients were raw material fed into its workings. The routine was inflexible, the expectations clear, the consequences for deviation swift and certain. The asylum promised cure through order, healing through discipline, recovery through submission to authority. Some patients did improve, their acute symptoms subsiding under the pressure of routine or simply with time. Others deteriorated, ground down by the monotony and powerlessness, their spirits breaking under the weight of institutional control. The moral treatment cured some, destroyed others, and maintained most in a liminal state between madness and sanity, confined indefinitely in a system that could neither heal them nor acknowledge its own failure. Chapter 5. The Attendants. The men and women who staffed the asylum wards came from the working poor, from rural villages and urban slums, drawn by the promise of steady employment, accommodation and meals. They were not nurses in any trained sense, not medical professionals, though the asylum authorities sometimes used that title to lend respectability to their positions. They were labourers, strong enough to manage violent patients, willing to accept the low pay and difficult conditions that characterised asylum work. Most had no education beyond basic literacy. Few possessed any understanding of mental illness, beyond common prejudice and whatever instruction the asylum provided during their first days of employment. These were the people granted absolute authority over the daily lives of patients, power exercised in corridors and day rooms far from the observation of medical superintendents or governing boards. The work was brutal and the hours long. Attendants lived on the asylum grounds, sleeping in small rooms near the wards they supervised. They worked shifts that stretched 12 or 14 hours, sometimes longer, when the asylum was short-staffed, which was frequently. A single attendant might be responsible for 30 or 40 patients during the night shift, walking corridors, checking rooms, responding to disturbances with no assistance except other exhausted staff in distant wings. The day shift was no easier. Rousing patients, supervising washing and dressing, maintaining order during meals, managing work details, enforcing rules, preventing escapes, intervening in fights or episodes of self-harm. The attendant was guard, servant and enforcer expected to maintain control through force of personality or actual force as circumstances required. The asylum authorities hired both men and women as attendants, assigning them to wards according to sex. Men supervised male patients, women the female wards. The pay was miserable. A male attendant might earn £20 per year, a female attendant £15. Room and board were provided, but the rooms were cramped and cold, the food the same institutional fare the patients ate. The work offered no path to advancement, no future beyond continuing in the same position year after year, until age, or injury, or simple exhaustion forced departure. The asylum hired whoever would accept these terms. Former domestic servants, agricultural labourers displaced by mechanisation, men who had failed at other trades, women without family support, the desperate and the unskilled. These were the people the asylum entrusted with the care of its most vulnerable inmates. Training consisted of a few days walking the wards with an experienced attendant, learning the routine, being told which patients were dangerous. Formal instruction in the nature of mental illness or appropriate treatment methods was non-existent in most institutions. Attendants learned by doing, by observing how senior staff managed difficult situations, by developing their own methods for maintaining control. Some approached the work with patience and even kindness, treating patients with basic human decency despite the constraints of the system. Others brought cruelty, frustrated by their own powerlessness in life, wielding their authority over patients as compensation for their low status in the world beyond the asylum walls. The attendant's primary duty was maintaining order. Quiet wards reflected well on staff competence. Superintendents and matrons judged attendants by their ability to prevent disturbances, to keep patients calm and compliant. An attendant whose ward was noisy where patients frequently fought or destroyed property, risked reprimand or dismissal. The pressure to maintain order by whatever means necessary was constant. If a patient could be kept quiet through kindness, well and good. If kindness failed, other methods were employed. The attendants had access to leather restraints, isolation rooms, cold baths, and their own physical strength. They used these tools freely, knowing that patient complaints would not be believed, that their version of events would be credited over any accusation from an inmate certified as insane. Violence from attendants toward patients was commonplace, though officially forbidden. A patient who refused to obey might be slapped, shoved, dragged by the hair. More severe beatings occurred away from public areas, in isolation rooms, or during the night when witnesses were few. Male attendants struck male patients. Female attendants could be equally brutal, skilled in methods that left no visible marks. Twisting arms, pinching, hair-pulling, verbal abuse, delivered in fierce whispers. The violence was rationalized as necessary discipline, as the only language the insane understood. Attendants who reported colleagues for patient abuse faced ostracism from staff or retaliation. The culture of the asylum ward protected those who maintained control regardless of method. Sexual exploitation occurred with disturbing frequency, particularly in female wards. Male attendants and even asylum officers held power over women who had no means of resistance or complaint. A patient who reported assault would not be believed. Her accusation would be recorded as delusion, as evidence of her continued insanity. The attendant might be questioned, but rarely face serious consequences. His word against hers, sanity against madness, authority against powerlessness. Some female patients became pregnant during their confinement. The official records attributed these pregnancies to moral insanity, to the woman's depraved nature, never to staff misconduct. The babies were taken at birth, sent to foundling homes or adopted out. The mother left to recover from childbirth and returned to the ward routine as if nothing had occurred. The attendants themselves lived in a state of chronic stress. The work was physically demanding and emotionally taxing, dealing hour after hour with human suffering, with patients who wept or screamed or sat in catatonic silence, wore down even the most resilient temperaments. The attendants had no counselling, no support for the psychological toll of their labour. They had each other, fellow staff who understood the pressures, and they had alcohol. Drinking among asylum staff was pervasive. Attendants smuggled spirits into their rooms, drank during off hours, sometimes during shifts. The asylum authorities knew and largely ignored the practice unless it led to obvious dereliction of duty. The drinking numbed the attendants to the misery surrounding them, made the work bearable, but it also fueled the violence and negligence that plagued the wards. Some attendants formed genuine attachments to patients, developed protective feelings toward those in their care. They might show small kindnesses, an extra blanket on a cold night, a word of encouragement, intervention to prevent abuse by other staff. These relationships were risky. Superintendents discouraged familiarity between staff and patients, viewing it as unprofessional, potentially dangerous. An attendant who advocated too strongly for a particular patient might be accused of favoritism or inappropriate involvement. The institutional culture demanded emotional distance, required attendants to view patients as objects to be managed, rather than individuals deserving sympathy or respect. The hierarchy among attendants was strict. Senior attendants supervised junior staff, reported infractions, controlled shift assignments. The chief attendant of each ward reported to the asylum matron or superintendent, serving as intermediary between medical authority and the workers who implemented daily care. Advancement to senior positions came through longevity and demonstrated ability to maintain order. The senior attendants often were the most rigid, most committed to institutional routine, most willing to use force. They had survived years in the asylum by becoming extensions of its power structure, and they trained newcomers to do the same. Attendants developed methods for managing specific types of patients. The violent were handled with immediate physical restraint. multiple staff overwhelming the patient and applying straitjackets or cuffs. The suicidal were placed on constant watch, never left alone, stripped of anything that might be used for self-harm. The delusional were largely ignored unless their delusions led to disruptive behaviour. The depressed were left to their misery unless they refused to eat or work. The attendants had no training in psychological intervention, no techniques for addressing the underlying causes of patient distress. They managed symptoms, suppressed behaviours, maintained the surface appearance of order, while the patient's internal suffering continued unabated. The relationship between attendants and medical staff was marked by mutual disrespect. Physicians viewed attendants as ignorant labourers, necessary but barely competent. Attendants viewed physicians as distant authorities who understood nothing of the actual work of managing wards, who gave orders without comprehending the practical difficulties of implementation. The superintendent made his rounds, spent a few minutes reviewing cases, issued instructions, and departed. The attendants remained, responsible for translating those instructions into action, for dealing with the consequences when treatments failed or patients reacted badly, for maintaining control during the 23 hours of each day when the superintendent was elsewhere in the vast institution. Staff turnover was high. Many attendants left within their first year, unable to tolerate the conditions. Others departed after a few years, worn down by the work or finding better opportunities elsewhere. The constant turnover meant that wards were often staffed by inexperienced attendants, people who did not know the patients, did not understand their individual histories or needs, who resorted to rigid rule enforcement and physical control because they lacked any other tools. The experienced attendants who remained year after year often became hardened, their capacity for empathy eroded by exposure to suffering. They were powerless to alleviate, transforming into the very figures of institutional cruelty that reformers would later expose and condemn. The attendants occupied a contradictory position. They were the asylum's lowest-ranking employees, poorly paid and poorly regarded, yet they held absolute power over patients, power to grant small mercies or inflict significant harm, power exercised in the spaces between official oversight, in the long night hours and the tedious days when no authority watched their actions. Some used this power responsibly within the constraints of a brutal system. Others abused it terribly. The asylum could not function without them, yet their very presence, untrained, unsupervised, often cruel, ensured that the therapeutic ideal could never be realized, that the moral treatment remained a fantasy imposed on a reality of violence and neglect. Chapter 6. Restraint and Punishment. The instruments hung on the walls of certain rooms or were stored in locked cabinets accessible only to attendants, or waited in the treatment rooms where patients were taken for procedures they had not consented to and could not refuse. Leather straps worn smooth by use, canvas jackets with long sleeves that tied behind the back, metal cuffs that fastened to the bed frames, chairs with the restraining bars, baths with canvas covers that trapped the patient in cold water for hours. These were the tools of control in the Victorian Asylum, employed with such frequency that their use became routine, unremarkable, documented in case notes with clinical detachment that obscured the suffering they caused. The straitjacket was ubiquitous. Heavy canvas reinforced at stress points, with sleeves that extended well past the hands. The patient's arms were forced into the sleeves, crossed over the chest, and the long sleeves tied behind the back, rendering the arms completely immobile. A jacket properly applied was inescapable. The patient could not feed themselves, could not wipe their face, could not adjust clothing or scratch an itch. They were reduced to complete helplessness, dependent on attendants for every basic need. Some patients were kept in straitjackets for days or weeks, released only for brief periods to prevent permanent damage to muscles and joints. The alienists justified the practice as necessary for violent patients who posed danger to themselves or others. In practice, straitjackets were applied to patients who were merely troublesome, who protested too loudly, who resisted the ward routine, who had angered an attendant. The leather cuffs attached patients to their beds, wrists and sometimes ankles fastened to the frame, forcing the patient to lie flat and immobile. This form of restraint was used at night for patients deemed at risk of wandering or of harming themselves or others during hours when attendant supervision was minimal. Patients fastened in this manner could not turn over, could not sit up, could not reach the chamber pot when nature called. They lay in their own waste until morning rounds when attendants released them. The humiliation was intentional, part of the punishment, a message that resistance to asylum authority would be met with degradation. The cuffs left marks on wrists, abrasions that became infected, circulation problems that caused permanent nerve damage. These injuries were noted in medical records but did not lead to cessation of the practice. The strong room or padded cell served as isolation chamber for the most violent. A small space, perhaps 8 feet square, walls lined with padding to prevent self-injury. No furniture, no light except what filtered under the door. The patient was placed inside, the door locked, and they remained for hours or days depending on the judgment of the medical superintendent or the attendant in charge. Food was pushed through a slot at floor level. The chamber pot was emptied once or twice daily. Otherwise, the patient existed in darkness and silence, cut off from all human contact, left alone with their terror or rage or despair. The experience was meant to be punitive, to break the patient's will, to demonstrate that continued resistance was futile. Some emerged from isolation subdued. Others emerged worse. Their mental state deteriorated by the experience, but the asylum recorded this deterioration as evidence of the patient's fundamental insanity, rather than as consequence of the treatment inflicted. The cold bath was both punishment and prescribed treatment. The theory held that cold water shocked the system, redirected blood flow, calmed excited nerves. The practice involved filling a bath with water kept deliberately cold, sometimes with ice added, and immersing the patient for periods ranging from minutes to hours. The patient might be held under supervision, or might be trapped in the bath by a canvas cover fastened over the top with only the head exposed. The cold was agonizing. Patients emerged blue and shivering, sometimes unconscious. Deaths occurred, attributed officially to the patient's condition rather than to the treatment. The cold bath was used for mania, for melancholia, for any behavior the attendants wished to punish, or the physicians wished to modify. Its frequency of use varied by institution and by the preferences of the medical superintendent, but few asylums entirely abandoned the practice. The rotating chair, less common by mid-century but still found in some institutions, spun patients at high speed until they became violently ill or lost consciousness. The theory behind this device held that the rotation would redistribute bodily fluids, restore balance to the system, calm the agitated mind. The reality was torture, pure and simple. Patients strapped into the chair and spun until they vomited, until they begged for mercy, until they passed out. The treatment was recorded in case notes as having been administered, the patient's response documented, and if improvement was not observed, the treatment might be repeated. The chair eventually fell out of favour, not because it was recognised as cruel, but because it produced no consistent therapeutic results, and because newer methods of control proved more convenient. Forced feeding was employed for patients who refused food. The alienists viewed refusal to eat a symptom of insanity requiring intervention. The procedure involved restraining the patient, forcing the mouth open, and inserting a tube down the throat through which liquid food was poured. The experience was terrifying and painful. Patients gagged and choked. The tube sometimes entered the windpipe instead of the esophagus, causing aspiration and pneumonia. The medical justification was preserving life, preventing death by starvation. The result was often prolonged suffering, the body kept alive while the will to live was destroyed. Some patients who initially refused food for reasons of depression or protest learned to eat rather than endure repeated forced feeding. Others persisted in their refusal and endured the procedure regularly, sometimes for years. Solitary confinement in single rooms without padding was used for patients deemed requiring isolation, but not dangerous enough for the strong room. These were small chambers with a bed bolted to the floor, a chamber pot, nothing else. The door had a small barred window through which attendants could observe. The patient remained in this room for days or weeks, let out only for brief exercise in a small private yard. Meals were brought to the room. The chamber pot was emptied daily. Otherwise, the patient existed in nearly complete isolation. Some used this time for reflection, emerging calmer. Many more deteriorated, the isolation exacerbating their mental distress, leading to worsening symptoms that the asylum staff interpreted as progression of disease rather than response to environment. Opium and its derivatives saw widespread use as chemical restraint. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was administered to agitated patients to produce sedation. The doses were often large, enough to render patients nearly unconscious. They spent their days in a drugged stupor, unable to cause trouble, easily managed by attendants. The medical notes recorded the administration of medication as treatment for mania or acute excitement. The long-term effects, addiction, cognitive impairment, physical deterioration, were noticed but not particularly concerning to alienists who viewed the patient's containment as more important than their long-term well-being. When patients became dependent on the opium, their withdrawal symptoms were interpreted as worsening of their underlying condition, justifying continued administration. Chloral hydrate became available in the latter half of the century and was embraced enthusiastically by asylum physicians. It produced sleep, deep and prolonged. Unmanageable patients were given large doses and slept for hours or days. The extended sleep was called treatment, labelled as rest cure. In practice, it was pharmacological imprisonment, removing the patient from consciousness, eliminating their troublesome behaviour by eliminating their consciousness. Some patients were kept in states of semi-consciousness for weeks, roused only for feeding and basic care, then drugged again. The practice was convenient for staff, reducing the labour of patient management, but its therapeutic value was nil. Physical labour was sometimes employed punitively beyond its official role in moral treatment. Patients who violated rules might be assigned to particularly difficult or unpleasant tasks. Scrubbing floors for hours, moving heavy loads, working in the coldest or hottest areas of the asylum. The labour was presented as therapeutic, but was experienced as punishment, designed to exhaust and humble the patient, to teach them that defiance led to suffering. Some patients broke under this treatment, becoming compliant out of sheer exhaustion. Others grew more resistant, their spirits hardening, their determination to maintain some sense of self-strengthening in response to the effort to break them. Deprivation of privileges served as lesser punishment. Loss of exercise periods meant confinement to the ward for days. Restriction of visitors isolated patients from family contact. Removal of small comforts, a particular food, a book, permission to write letters, reminded patients that everything they had was by institutional grace, that any aspect of their existence could be withdrawn at any moment. The punishments were calibrated to the offence, at least in theory. In practice, they were arbitrary, depending on the mood of attendants and the policies of superintendents who ranged from relatively lenient to extraordinarily harsh. The asylum authorities defended these practices as medical necessities. Patients were insane, they argued, and insanity rendered individuals dangerous to themselves and others. Restraint protected patients from self-injury. Isolation prevented harm to fellow patients. Sedation calmed excitement that might otherwise lead to violence or exhaustion. The cold bath cooled overheated systems. Forced feeding preserved life. Every intervention, no matter how brutal, was framed as therapeutic, as acting in the patient's best interest even when the patient experienced it as torture. The alienists published papers defending their methods, citing case studies where improvement followed treatment, ignoring or explaining away the cases where patients were harmed or killed. Reformers occasionally challenged these practices. Reports from visiting magistrates or journalists who gained access to asylums exposed conditions that shocked the public. Parliamentary inquiries were held. Regulations were proposed to limit the use of mechanical restraint, to improve oversight, to protect patients from abuse. The asylum authorities responded with resistance, arguing that outsiders did not understand the practical necessities of managing the violently insane, that restrictions on restraint would lead to chaos, that they were doing their best under difficult circumstances. Some reforms were implemented. Asylums were required to maintain restraint books documenting every use of mechanical restraint to be reviewed by visiting committees. In practice, these books were often incomplete or falsified, recording only a fraction of actual restraint use, and the visiting committees lacked the expertise or inclination to question what they were shown. The patients endured. They learned the rules and the consequences of breaking them. They learned to hide their distress, to suppress behaviours that triggered punishment, to perform compliance even when compliance was beyond their capacity. Some internalized the asylum's judgment of them, came to believe they deserved the treatment they received, that their suffering was necessary consequence of their madness. Others maintained a core of resistance, an internal knowledge that what was being done to them was wrong, that the asylum's claims of treatment were lies masking violence and control. These patients survived in small acts of defiance, in whispered confidence, in the preservation of memory and identity against an institution designed to erase both. The instruments of restraint and punishment were the asylum's final argument, the means by which it enforced its will when all other methods failed. They were wielded against the most vulnerable members of society, people whose capacity to resist or report abuse had been legally eliminated by their certification as insane. The practices continued for decades, justified by medical authority, hidden behind asylum walls, inflicted on thousands who had no advocate, no voice, no escape except death, or the mercy of discharge that for most never came. Chapter 7. The Women's Wards. The female wards occupied their own wing of the asylum, separated from the male patients by locked doors and the institutional conviction that women's madness differed fundamentally from that of men. The alienists believed that female insanity arose from the peculiarities of the female body, from the reproductive system that governed women's emotional and mental states. The uterus was seen as seat of female disorder. Its functions, menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, menopause, each carrying potential for mental breakdown. A woman's mind was thought more delicate than a man's, more susceptible to disorder, more likely to tip into hysteria or melancholia. These beliefs shaped every aspect of how female patients were treated, creating a regime that combined medical authority with Victorian assumptions about proper feminine behaviour. The women who entered the female wards came from all stations of life, though the majority were poor. Some had been domestic servants, their positions lost when nervous symptoms or behavioural irregularities made them unemployable. Others had been wives, committed by husbands who found them troublesome, who tired of their tears or their complaints or their failure to perform domestic duties with sufficient cheerfulness. Unmarried women who exhibited sexual interest, who became pregnant outside marriage, who defied fathers or brothers, these too found their way to the asylum, their defiance reframed as moral insanity requiring institutional correction. Elderly women whose families could no longer care for them, young women whose grief following bereavement exceeded acceptable bounds, women who heard voices or saw visions or simply could not cope with lives of unrelenting hardship, all were absorbed into the female wards. The process of admission stripped women of more than freedom. Their hair was inspected for vermin, sometimes cut short despite their protests. Long hair was a woman's glory in Victorian society, and its loss marked the first step in the erasure of feminine identity. Their clothing was removed and replaced with institutional dress, shapeless garments that eliminated any possibility of personal expression. Corsets were forbidden, deemed dangerous for their potential use in suicide attempts, though the real effect was to leave women's bodies unsupported in ways that Victorian propriety considered indecent. Jewellery, hairpins, anything that might be used as weapon or tool for self-harm was confiscated. The woman who emerged from the admission process bore little resemblance to the person who had arrived, her transformation into asylum inmate visible in every detail of her appearance. The female attendants who staffed these wards were women from the working class, often former domestic servants themselves. They brought to their work the rigid morality of their backgrounds, the belief that women should be quiet, obedient, modest, industrious. Patients who violated these expectations faced particular censure. A woman who spoke loudly was deemed hysterical. A woman who expressed anger was violent. A woman who moved her body freely or touched herself was exhibiting signs of nymphomania. The attendants enforced conformity to feminine ideals with the tools available to them: restraint, isolation, cold baths, verbal abuse. They were as trapped by the system as the patients, their low pay and difficult working conditions breeding resentment that found outlet in cruelty towards those even more powerless than themselves. The work assigned to female patients reflected Victorian assumptions about women's proper sphere. The laundry consumed the labour of dozens of women who spent their days in steaming rooms, hands raw from harsh soap and hot water, backs aching from bending over wash tubs and wringing wet linens. The work was exhausting and endless. As soon as one load was washed and hung to dry, another arrived. The heat in the laundry was oppressive, particularly in summer, the air thick with moisture that made breathing difficult. Women fainted regularly. Some developed respiratory ailments from the constant dampness. The work was considered therapeutic, keeping idle hands busy, but its real purpose was economic. The asylum required clean linens, and unpaid patient labour provided them. The sewing room offered slightly better conditions, but was no less monotonous. Women sat on hard benches for hours, mending sheets and clothing, stitching garments for asylum use. Their fingers became calloused, their eyes strained by poor light and fine work. Those who had been seamstresses before their confinement might find some satisfaction in skilled work, but most simply endured the hours of repetitive labour. The attendants monitored constantly, ensuring no conversation, no pause in work. Needles were counted before and after each session, the fear being that a patient might secret one away for use as weapon. The precaution was reasonable given the number of women who sought any means to end their suffering, but it added another layer of surveillance to an already oppressive environment. The peculiar diagnoses applied to women reflected medical theories of the era and social control masquerading as science. Puerperal insanity affected women following childbirth, their depression or confusion attributed to the shock of delivery rather than to the circumstances of their lives. Poverty, lack of support, too many children already, abusive husbands. These women were separated from their newborns immediately upon asylum admission, the infants sent away, the mothers left to grieve while alienists recorded their tears as symptom of ongoing illness. Some recovered and were discharged, returning to lives that had not changed, to the same conditions that had precipitated their breakdown. Others remained in the asylum, their separation from their children permanent, the loss compounding their original distress. Hysteria was diagnosed with stunning frequency. The symptoms were vague and all-encompassing. A woman who complained of pains without obvious physical cause was hysterical. A woman who wept excessively, who laughed inappropriately, who experienced fainting spells or convulsions, who expressed dissatisfaction with her lot, all could be labelled hysterical and confined for treatment. The treatments themselves were often invasive and traumatic. Pelvic examinations conducted by male physicians with female attendants present to maintain propriety but not to protect the patient. Applications of leeches to the genitals based on theories about redirecting blood flow. Cold water douches aimed at the reproductive organs. These procedures were justified as medical treatment, but were experienced as violation, as punishment for the crime of being female and distressed. Nymphomania as a diagnosis allowed the confinement of women whose sexuality troubled their families or society. A wife who expressed desire too frequently, who sought satisfaction outside marriage, who masturbated. These behaviours were pathologized, treated as symptoms of disease requiring cure. The treatments were punitive, restraints that prevented access to one's own body, cold baths to dampen sexual ardour, isolation to prevent any stimulation. In extreme cases, surgical interventions were proposed and sometimes performed: clitoridectomy, the removal of the clitoris, an operation that mutilated women in the name of curing their excessive desire. The procedure was rare but not unknown in British asylums, championed by physicians who believed that female sexuality beyond the narrowly defined bounds of procreative marital relations constituted illness. The elderly women in the asylum faced particular neglect. Many suffered from what would later be recognised as dementia, the deterioration of cognitive function with age. The Victorians had no understanding of this process, no treatment to offer. These women wandered the wards confused, calling for family members long dead, unable to care for themselves. They required constant supervision but received minimal attention. Attendants had no patience for the endless repetitive questions, the incontinence, the inability to follow simple instructions. The elderly patients were fed, kept minimally clean and otherwise ignored. They died in the asylum, their final years spent in confusion and isolation. Their deaths recorded as natural consequences of age, though the conditions of their confinement hastened their decline. Younger women, particularly those from middle-class backgrounds, sometimes received different treatment. If family remained involved and willing to pay for private accommodation, a patient might have a single room rather than sleeping in a crowded dormitory. She might be excused from the harshest labour. Her visitors might be received more graciously, but even these small privileges could not overcome the fundamental reality of confinement in an institution designed for control rather than care. The private patient still lived by asylum rules, still submitted to treatment she did not want, still faced years or decades of imprisonment regardless of whether her symptoms improved. Pregnancy in the asylum was always complicated. Some women arrived already pregnant, their condition contributing to their admission. Others became pregnant during confinement, the result of sexual assault by attendants or other staff, though official records attributed these pregnancies to moral insanity or visits from husbands. The pregnant patient received no special care. She worked until labour began, gave birth in the asylum infirmary with minimal medical attention, and was returned to the ward within days. The infant was taken immediately. If the woman had family willing to accept the child, arrangements were made for removal. If not, the baby went to a foundling hospital where its chances of survival were poor. The mother was given no time to bond with her child, no opportunity to grieve its loss. She was expected to resume ward routine as if nothing had occurred. Menstruation was managed with rags that patients washed themselves, inadequate and humiliating. The asylum provided nothing in the way of sanitary supplies. Women bled through their clothing, suffered the discomfort and embarrassment, were punished for soiling bedding or furniture. The attendants viewed menstruation as troublesome, requiring extra work. Patients who were particularly difficult during their monthly courses might be restrained or isolated, the natural physical and emotional effects of menstruation interpreted as increased madness, requiring control. The visiting physician made his rounds through the female wards, accompanied by female attendants who were present for propriety. He spent little time with individual patients, a brief observation, a question or two, a notation in the casebook. If a patient was menstruating, if she'd recently given birth, if she complained of pelvic pain, these facts were noted and attributed to female disorders of the reproductive system. Treatment rarely varied: rest, cold baths, sedation. The alienists had no real understanding of female physiology beyond rudimentary knowledge, but they compensated for ignorance with authority, speaking confidently about conditions they barely comprehended, prescribing treatments whose effectiveness was never seriously evaluated. The bonds between female patients sometimes provided the only comfort available in the wards. Women formed friendships, alliances, relationships that sustained them through years of confinement. They shared confidences, offered what support they could, protected one another from the worst abuses when possible. Some relationships were romantic or sexual, physical affection, sought as comfort against the coldness of institutional life. The attendants watched for such connections and moved swiftly to suppress them. Women found holding hands or embracing were separated, sometimes punished. The asylum authorities viewed female intimacy with suspicion, interpreting it as evidence of moral disorder requiring intervention. Letters from female patients to families often pleaded for release, described conditions in terms meant to evoke sympathy and action. These letters, when they reached the superintendent's desk for review, were typically withheld. The woman's desperation was reframed as proof of her continued illness. A sane woman, reasoning went, would accept her confinement as necessary treatment and trust in medical authority. Only the mad protested their sanity. The circular logic was perfect and inescapable. The female patient's own words were used against her. Her attempts to advocate for herself interpreted as symptoms justifying her continued imprisonment. The discharged female patient faced enormous challenges re-entering society. Years in the asylum had marked her. She had been certified insane, a fact that would follow her. Finding employment was difficult. Many former domestic servants could not return to service, their asylum history making them unemployable in respectable households. Marriage prospects for unmarried women essentially ended with asylum admission. Husbands who had committed wives sometimes refused to take them back, having already made other arrangements. The woman discharged from the asylum often had nowhere to go, no means of support, and risked readmission within months, simply because surviving in the outside world proved impossible. The female wards embodied Victorian society's deepest anxieties about women, and its determination to control female behaviour through medical authority. The asylum became instrument for enforcing conformity to rigid gender norms, for punishing women who failed to be sufficiently quiet, obedient, sexually restrained, emotionally controlled. The therapeutic rationale provided cover for what was essentially disciplinary incarceration, the transformation of social deviance into medical pathology. Behind the locked doors of the female wards, thousands of women lived and died, their suffering invisible to a society that had decided they were better off confined. Their stories lost to history except in the fragmentary records that reduced their complex lives to diagnostic labels and symptom lists. Chapter 8. The Incurable. The back wards of the asylum housed those for whom hope had been abandoned. These were the chronic patients, individuals who had been confined for years or decades, whose conditions had not improved with treatment or had worsened, who no longer attracted the attention of physicians interested in therapeutic success. They were the forgotten, the permanent residents of an institution designed for temporary care, people whose identities had been absorbed entirely by the role of patient. They shuffled through ward routines worn smooth by repetition, their days indistinguishable one from another, their futures stretching ahead as endless continuation of the present until death finally released them, the chronic. Wards were visibly different from the acute wards. Less attention was paid to cleanliness, to maintenance, to the small amenities that might make confinement bearable. Paint peeled from walls and was not repaired. Broken furniture went unreplaced. The smell was worse. Decades of institutional life had saturated the very stones with the odours of unwashed bodies. Carbolic, boiled food, despair. The patients themselves bore the marks of long confinement. Bodies bent from years of poor posture, inadequate exercise, institutional diet, faces blank, affect flattened by time and medication, eyes that looked without seeing, minds turned inward or simply emptied by the grinding monotony of asylum existence. Some of the chronic patients had been admitted young and grown old within the asylum walls. A woman confined at 20 for melancholia following childbirth now sat at 60. Her reproductive years passed in isolation. Her child long since grown and moved on without memory of the mother who had been taken away. A man admitted at 30 for religious mania was now 70, his fervour long since extinguished, replaced by the dull routine of the chronic ward where no one cared what he believed or did not believe, so long as he caused no trouble. These patients had no memory of the outside world that was not decades old. Everything they knew of recent history came second-hand, through fragments overheard from attendants or rare visitors, through newspapers if the asylum provided them, which many did not. The asylum had become their world entire. They knew every corridor, every day room, every corner of the airing court. They knew the routines better than the attendants knew them, could predict the timing of bells and meals and shift changes with perfect accuracy. They knew which attendants were kind, which were cruel, which could be approached with small requests and which would respond with violence. They had learned to be invisible, to avoid notice, to exist in the spaces between institutional attention. Drawing attention meant risk of being moved to a different ward, risk of new treatments being attempted, risk of punishment for infractions real or imagined. The medical notes for chronic patients grew sparse over time. Early in a patient's confinement, the casebook might contain detailed observations, records of symptoms and behaviours, attempts at diagnosis and treatment. As years passed and the patient failed to improve, the entries became brief and formulaic. No change in condition. Behaviour remains as before, continues in usual state. The alienists had lost interest. These patients offered nothing to professional advancement, no case studies to publish, no cures to demonstrate. They were simply there, occupying beds, consuming resources, requiring minimal maintenance until death provided the only discharge possible. Families forgot or chose to forget. Visits that had been monthly became quarterly, then annual, then ceased entirely. The reasons were understandable if not excusable. Life continued outside the asylum. Family members married, moved, died. New generations arose who had never known the confined relative or knew them only as shameful secret. The mad aunt or uncle never discussed. The lost family member whose existence was acknowledged in whispers if at all. For the chronic patient, this abandonment was gradual and inexorable. The intervals between visits lengthened. Then one visit would be the last. Though neither patient nor visitor knew it at the time, years might pass before the patient accepted that no one was coming, that they had been erased from family memory and concern. Some chronic patients had outlived everyone who had known them before confinement. Parents dead, siblings dead, spouses remarried or deceased, children grown and scattered, addresses unknown, unwilling to acknowledge the parent mouldering in asylum backwards. These patients had no connection to the outside world, no one who remembered them as they had been before madness or diagnosis, or simply misfortune had led to their imprisonment. Their existence was purely institutional. They were known only as patients, only by the diagnoses recorded in casebooks, only by the behaviours that had justified their ongoing confinement. The work assigned to chronic patients was minimal if assigned at all. They had lost the capacity for sustained effort or had never possessed it. Some were employed at simple tasks, folding laundry, sweeping corridors, moving objects from one location to another. The work was ache work, activity for its own sake rather than any productive purpose, something to fill the hours between waking and sleep. Other chronic patients did nothing, sat in day rooms staring at walls or at their own hands, existing in states of profound emptiness that no intervention addressed or attempted to address. Institutionalization left visible marks. The chronic patient moved differently than the newly admitted, shuffling rather than walking with purpose, eyes downcast, shoulders rounded. Speech patterns changed, became simpler, more childlike. Complex thoughts were difficult to articulate after years of having every expression met with dismissal or punishment. Some patients stopped speaking entirely, not from inability, but from the recognition that speech served no purpose, that no one listened, that words changed nothing. This mutism was recorded as symptom of deterioration, evidence that the underlying condition was worsening, never as rational response to an environment that rendered communication meaningless. The physical health of chronic patients was generally poor. Years of inadequate diet, lack of exercise, poor sanitation, and minimal medical care took their toll. Tuberculosis was common in the crowded wards with their poor ventilation. Patients coughed blood into handkerchiefs, weakened and died, their deaths attributed to consumption, though the conditions of confinement had facilitated its diseases spread. Dental problems went untreated until teeth rotted and fell out. Vision problems meant patients stumbled and fell but received no spectacles to correct failing sight. Chronic pain from old injuries or progressive conditions like arthritis was noted, but rarely addressed beyond occasional doses of laudanum. The elderly chronic patients presented particular challenges and received minimal attention. A patient committed at 60 and reaching 80 had spent 20 years in the asylum, 2 decades of life consumed by the institutional existence. They required assistance with basic activities, dressing, eating, toileting. The attendants, already stretched thin, resented the additional labour. The elderly patients were handled roughly, shouted at when they moved too slowly, left in soiled clothing because changing them required effort. When they became bedridden, they developed pressure sores that went untreated, became infected, contributed to deaths that were recorded as natural, though better care might have prevented them. Some chronic patients maintained a core of resistance, a sense of self that the asylum had not entirely eroded. They might insist on small dignities, combing their hair a particular way with whatever comb they could obtain, keeping their corner of the ward as neat as possible given the limited resources available, maintaining routines of their own making that provided structure beyond what the institution imposed. These small acts of autonomy were significant, markers of personhood persisting despite years of dehumanization. The attendants sometimes found these patients irritating, their insistence on individual preference disrupting the smooth functioning of ward routine. Others surrendered entirely to institutional identity. They no longer remembered who they had been before the asylum. Their sense of self had merged completely with their status as patient. They could not imagine existence outside the wards, had no desire for discharge even if it were offered. The asylum had become safety, the known world, however terrible, preferable to the unknown beyond its walls. These patients had been broken by the system, transformed into precisely what the asylum assumed they were, incapable of independent function, requiring permanent custodial care, existing rather than living. The deaths of chronic patients occurred with such frequency that they barely registered as events. Another bed emptied, another name crossed from the ward list, another body wrapped in a shroud and carried to the asylum cemetery. Or, if family could be located and chose to claim the remains, released for burial elsewhere. Most were buried in the asylum grounds, their graves marked by numbers rather than names, rows of identical headstones or simple markers recording only the year of death. No mourners attended these burials. Perhaps a chaplain spoke brief words over the grave. More often, the asylum workmen simply dug the hole, lowered the body filled it in, and moved on to whatever task awaited next. The records of chronic patients documented decline but offered no insight into the inner lives of these individuals. What did they think about during the long hours of imposed idleness? What memories sustained them or haunted them? What dreams, if any, survived the years of confinement? The alienist did not ask and would not have believed the answers if given. The chronic patients were beyond cure, beyond interest, beyond the boundaries of what the asylum considered its proper concern. They were warehoused, maintained at minimal cost, kept alive but not permitted to live, existing in a state suspended between life and death, until death finally arrived as mercy the asylum had never provided. The back wards represented the asylum system's greatest failure. The institutions had been built with promises of cure, of therapeutic intervention that would restore the mad to sanity and productivity. Instead, they had created a population of permanent inmates, people whose confinement had become self-perpetuating, whose symptoms were exacerbated by the very conditions meant to treat them, whose opportunities for discharge diminished with each passing year until they reached zero. The chronic patients were the evidence of promises broken, of a system that had abandoned its stated purpose and settled into the simpler task of containment. Yet they endured. Through decades of monotony and neglect, through the erosion of identity and hope, through the daily humiliations and occasional cruelties that characterized chronic ward existence, they endured. Some maintained their humanity through acts of kindness toward fellow patients, sharing what little they had, offering comfort when comfort was desperately needed. Others endured through sheer biological persistence, bodies continuing to function long after minds had retreated into unreachable places. They were the living ghosts of Victorian society's humanitarian promises, the permanent residents of institutions that had been designed to empty themselves of patients cured and returned to the world. Instead, the wards filled and stayed filled, populated by those for whom the asylum had become both prison and home, the only place left in a world that had erased them from memory and concern. Chapter 9. The Reformers and the Scandals. The asylum system operated largely in shadow, its practices hidden behind walls that few outsiders penetrated. The public knew asylums existed, knew they housed the insane, but possessed little detailed knowledge of what occurred within. This obscurity served the interests of asylum authorities who preferred to conduct their work without scrutiny. But obscurity could not be maintained indefinitely. Gradually, through the efforts of the reformers, journalists, and former patients, reports of asylum conditions began to reach the public, creating scandals that briefly focused attention on institutional abuses before the attention wandered elsewhere, and the asylums continued much as they had before. The visiting magistrates appointed under lunacy legislation had authority to inspect asylums and hear patient complaints. Some took their responsibilities seriously, conducting thorough examinations, questioning patients privately, reviewing records with attention to inconsistencies. Others performed cursory visits, accepted the superintendent's assurances at face value, and filed reports commending the asylum's management. The quality of oversight depended entirely on individual conscientiousness, and conscientious magistrates were minority. Most were gentlemen unfamiliar with mental illness, uncomfortable in the presence of the insane, willing to defer to medical authority on matters they did not understand. Their visits were announced in advance, allowing asylum staff to prepare, to ensure the most presentable patients were visible, to hide or restrain those whose appearance or behaviour might raise questions. Occasionally a magistrate proved more diligent than the asylum anticipated. In 1858, during a routine inspection of Surrey County Asylum, a visiting justice insisted on examining the restraint books and discovered that the recorded uses of mechanical restraint represented only a fraction of actual practice. Further investigation revealed systematic falsification of records, patients kept in restraints for weeks without documentation, deaths occurring under suspicious circumstances. The superintendent was forced to resign, an inquiry was held, reforms were promised. Within a year, the asylum had returned to previous practices under new leadership, the reforms quietly abandoned as unworkable given the realities of managing hundreds of difficult patients with limited staff. The newspapers provided avenue for exposure when individual journalists took interest in asylum conditions. In the 1860s, several London papers published accounts of life inside asylums based on information from discharged patients and former staff willing to speak publicly. The reports described overcrowding, violence from attendants, patients kept in restraints as punishment, inadequate food, minimal medical care. The public response was outrage, briefly. Questions were raised in Parliament. The commissioners in lunacy, the body responsible for asylum oversight, issued statements acknowledging problems while defending the general operation of the system. Specific abuses would be addressed, they assured, but the asylum model itself remained sound. The most effective voices for reform often came from those who had experienced asylum confinement and survived to tell their stories. John Thomas Percival, son of an assassinated Prime Minister, had been confined in 2 private asylums during a period of religious mania in the 1830s. Upon his recovery and discharge, he published accounts of his treatment that were searing in their honesty and detail. He described being restrained for months, subjected to cold baths and beatings, denied the right to speak in his own defence, treated as object rather than person. His social position gave him platform that other former patients lacked. His testimony carried weight precisely because he could not be dismissed as merely mad, though asylum defenders attempted to do so anyway, suggesting his criticisms were symptoms of residual illness. The alleged Lunatics' Friend Society was established in 1845 by former patients and their advocates, with the goal of investigating wrongful confinement and asylum abuses. The society maintained that many individuals were unjustly committed, that families used asylum certification to remove inconvenient relatives, that the safeguards in the commitment process were inadequate. They collected testimonies, published pamphlets, lobbied for legislative reform. Their efforts met resistance from the medical establishment, from asylum superintendents who resented outside interference, from families who insisted their relatives required confinement. The society achieved modest successes, individual cases reviewed, occasional discharges secured, attention drawn to specific abuses, but could not fundamentally alter the system that generated the problems they opposed. Louisa Lowe was committed by her husband in 1870 after she converted to spiritualism, a belief system he found embarrassing. She was confined in various private asylums for years, subjected to treatments she did not want, denied the right to appeal her certification. Upon finally securing her release, she became tireless advocate for married women's rights in lunacy certification, arguing that a husband's ability to commit his wife without her consent or adequate oversight constituted legalized abuse. She testified before parliamentary committees, published her experiences, organized other women who had suffered similar fates. Her advocacy contributed to reforms in the 1880s that provided some additional protections, though husbands retained considerable power to institutionalize wives throughout the Victorian period. The scandals that erupted periodically followed predictable patterns. An abuse would be exposed through patient complaint that reached sympathetic outsider, or through staff member with troubled conscience, or through death of patient under circumstances too suspicious to ignore. Investigation would reveal that the specific abuse was not isolated incident but systematic practice. Public outcry would follow, officials would promise reform. The asylum superintendent and perhaps some attendants would be dismissed or prosecuted if the abuse was egregious enough. New policies would be implemented. Within months or years, the practices would resume under different names or in slightly modified forms, the fundamental problems unaddressed because they arose from the structure of the asylum system itself. Colney Hatch Asylum the Massive, Middlesex institution, faced scandal in 1852, barely a year after opening. Patients were found kept in chains, contrary to the asylum's claims of practicing moral treatment without mechanical restraint. Deaths from tuberculosis were occurring at alarming rates due to overcrowding and poor ventilation. The superintendent blamed inadequate funding and excessive patient numbers, arguing that he could not maintain therapeutic environment when the asylum housed twice its intended capacity. The commissioners found his explanations unsatisfactory and issued critical report. Improvements were ordered. Some were made, briefly, before fiscal pressures and continued overcrowding made them unsustainable. The Bethlehem Royal Hospital, oldest psychiatric institution in Britain, reformed its practices earlier than many asylums, eliminating public viewing of patients and improving conditions in response to 18th century criticism. By the Victorian era, it presented itself as a model institution, admitting only acute cases, discharging those who did not improve within a year. But investigation in 1853 revealed that discharged patients often had nowhere to go and simply moved from Bethlehem to poorer county asylums where conditions were worse. The hospital's impressive discharge statistics represented transfer of chronic patients to less visible institutions rather than evidence of successful treatment. The revelation complicated narratives about asylum reform, demonstrating that improvements in one institution might simply relocate problems elsewhere. The private madhouses operated with even less oversight than public asylums and generated their share of scandals. These for-profit institutions accepted paying patients, offered various degrees of comfort depending on rates charged, and had every incentive to retain patients as long as families continued payment. Cases emerged of sane individuals confined at the request of relatives seeking to control family wealth, or eliminate inconvenient claimants to inheritances. The certification requirements could be satisfied by compliant physicians willing to diagnose insanity on minimal evidence. Once committed to a private madhouse, escape was nearly impossible. The patient's protests were interpreted as symptoms, correspondence was intercepted, visitors could be turned away on grounds that contact would disturb the patient. Legal reforms attempted to address the most obvious abuses. The 1890 Lunacy Act strengthened oversight of private institutions, required more rigorous documentation of reasons for commitment, established procedures for patients to petition for release. But the reforms relied on self-reporting by institutions and review by bodies with limited resources and staff. The violations that came to light represented a small fraction of actual abuses. Most asylum residents had no advocates outside the walls, no one to investigate their cases or question their confinement. They suffered in obscurity, their stories lost except when circumstances brought them briefly to public attention. The reformers faced enormous obstacles. The asylum system was vast, employing thousands, consuming significant public funds, supported by medical authorities who defended their practices as scientifically sound. Challenging the system meant questioning expertise, suggesting that doctors were mistaken or worse. It meant convincing the public to care about the welfare of the insane, a population most people preferred not to think about. It meant sustaining attention long enough to implement meaningful change when new scandals competed for public interest with wars, political crises, economic downturns, and the countless other events that filled newspaper columns. Some reforms did take hold. The use of mechanical restraint decreased in later decades, not eliminated but employed less frequently and with more documentation. Patient correspondence received somewhat more protection, though censorship continued. Oversight bodies gained modest additional powers, but the fundamental problems persisted. Overcrowding, inadequate staffing, institutional violence, the warehousing of chronic patients, the use of asylum commitment as solution to social problems rather than as medical treatment for genuine illness. The reformers chipped at the edges of these problems, but could not dismantle the structure that created them. By the century's end, the asylum population continued to grow despite decades of reform efforts. The institutions built to cure had become permanent holding facilities, places where society sent those it could not accommodate or would not tolerate. The scandals exposed abuses, but did not change the reality that asylum served social control functions more than therapeutic ones. The reformers' voices grew quieter, exhausted by small victories and large defeats, aware that the asylum system would outlast their efforts to transform it. The Victorian era would close with tens of thousands still confined, still subjected to treatments that harmed more than helped, still waiting for liberation that for most would never come, except through death. Chapter 10. The Slow Fade. The century turned and the asylums remained, vast institutions dotting the British landscape, their populations swelling beyond all original projections. The early promise of moral treatment had faded into distant memory. The alienists of the new generation inherited buildings and systems that had long since abandoned therapeutic ambition in favour of simple containment. The medical superintendents who assumed leadership of asylums in the 1890s and 1900s were administrators more than healers, managers of impossibly overcrowded facilities, their days consumed by paperwork and disciplinary matters, their clinical responsibilities reduced to brief ward rounds among hundreds of patients they could not possibly know as individuals. The architectural optimism of mid-century, when asylums rose with their tall windows and spacious day rooms, had given way to utilitarian expansion. New wings were added with minimal concern for light or air or any element that might contribute to patient well-being. The priority was beds, space to accommodate the ever-increasing numbers. County asylums built for 300 patients housed 800 or 1,000. Dormitories became so crowded that beds touched side by side with barely room to walk between them. Day rooms designed for 40 patients packed in twice that number, with nowhere to sit, forcing patients to stand or crouch against walls. The airing courts became yards where hundreds circled in forced exercise, the crush of bodies making actual movement difficult. The reasons for the population explosion were debated but never adequately explained. Some pointed to industrial urbanization, arguing that city life with its stresses and dislocations produced more madness than rural existence. Others suggested that families had greater access to asylum commitment processes and used them more readily, seeing institutionalization as a solution to problems that previous generations might have managed at home. The medical profession's expanding definitions of insanity certainly played a role, pathologizing ever more behaviors and emotional states. The asylum had become available, and once available, found itself used to capacity and beyond. The staff-to-patient ratios deteriorated steadily. An attendant who in 1850 might have supervised 15 patients now managed 40 or 50. Impossible oversight, inadequate care, increased reliance on restraint and sedation simply to maintain minimal order. The attendants themselves became more brutal as working conditions worsened, their low pay unchanged while their labour intensified. The turnover accelerated, experienced staff departing, their positions filled by whoever would accept the terms, training reduced to a few days or even hours before new attendants found themselves responsible for wards they did not understand, filled with patients they could not help. The treatments evolved but did not improve. Moral treatment's emphasis on routine and occupation gave way to somatic approaches, interventions targeting the body in hopes of affecting the mind. Hydrotherapy expanded beyond the punitive cold bath to include various water treatments. Prolonged warm baths meant to calm excited patients, wet sheet packs wrapping patients tightly in cold wet canvas. The continuous bath appeared in some asylums, large tubs where patients remained immersed for days or weeks, canvas covers keeping them in the water with only head exposed. The treatment was presented as humane alternative to restraint, but patients experienced it as torment, their skin pruning and breaking down, their bodies weakened by the prolonged immersion. Medications multiplied, though understanding of their effects remained primitive. Bromides were administered liberally for agitation and epilepsy, the doses high enough to produce toxic effects, skin eruptions, confusion, weakness, that were sometimes mistaken for symptoms of the original condition. Formaldehyde became common, its foul smell permeating wards where it was used to sedate difficult patients. Chloral hydrate continued in use despite its dangers, patients dying from overdoses or from respiratory depression when it was combined with other sedatives. The goal was chemical control, rendering patients manageable through pharmacology when staff had neither time nor resources for any other intervention. The eugenic movement of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods cast new shadow over asylum populations. Theories about hereditary degeneracy and the need to prevent the unfit from reproducing led to calls for the permanent segregation of the insane. What had been conceived as temporary therapeutic confinement was reimagined as necessary social quarantine, protecting society from contamination by defective genetic material. Some alienists embraced eugenic thinking enthusiastically, arguing that asylum populations should be segregated by sex to prevent breeding, that those with hereditary conditions should never be discharged. The theories provided fresh justification for practices that were already occurring, gave scientific veneer to what was essentially permanent imprisonment of the poor and troublesome. Sterilization was proposed, though not widely implemented in Britain as it would be in some other nations. The discussion itself reveals the shift in how asylum populations were understood. They were no longer patients who might recover, but specimens of evolutionary failure, warnings about what happened when natural selection was thwarted by civilization's impulse toward charity. The language used in medical journals grew harsher, more explicitly classist and racist. The asylum protected society not by curing individuals but by removing them from the breeding population, preventing their defects from being passed to future generations. The First World War brought new crisis to already strained system. Male attendants were conscripted or volunteered for military service, leaving asylums desperately short-staffed. Women and elderly men filled the positions and the quality of care declined further. Resources were diverted to the war effort. Food became scarce, patients' diets worsening, maintenance was deferred, buildings deteriorated. The death rate in asylums increased notably during the war years. Patients succumbing to malnutrition, tuberculosis, influenza, neglect. The asylums became warehouses of the dying, institutions where confinement itself had become death sentence, though the execution was slow. Some patients were discharged during the war years to create bed space for shell-shocked soldiers requiring psychiatric care. The chronic patients who had been confined for decades suddenly found themselves released not because they had recovered, but because their beds were needed. Many had nowhere to go, no family remaining, no skills for employment after years of institutionalization. They wandered briefly before dying or being recommitted. Others managed to survive outside the asylum walls, their ability to function revealing that they might never have required lifelong confinement, that the years they had lost to institutional custody had been unnecessary. The post-war years saw brief surge in reform rhetoric. The suffering of shell-shocked soldiers, men from respectable families who had been broken by war, created new sympathy for mental illness and those who experienced it. If war could drive a brave soldier mad, perhaps madness was not always sign of moral or genetic failing. The shell-shock patients were treated differently than civilian patients, given access to newer therapies, housed in separate facilities, shown the compassion and individualized care that chronic asylum populations never received. The disparity was obvious and troubling, evidence that quality of psychiatric care depended on class and circumstance rather than need or severity of condition. But the brief window of reform interest closed as the nation turned to other concerns. The asylum populations remained, still growing, still warehoused in deteriorating facilities, still subjected to treatments that range from useless to harmful. The Victorian asylum system limped into the 20th century, its architecture crumbling, its staff demoralized, its patients forgotten, its original mission abandoned in all but rhetoric. The great humanitarian project of the 19th century, the attempt to bring order and healing to the chaos of madness, had produced instead a vast apparatus of confinement that consumed lives and produced little beyond suffering. The patients in the twilight years of the Victorian asylum system knew they were forgotten. The world beyond the walls had moved on, embraced new technologies and ideas, fought a devastating war, and begun rebuilding. Inside the asylum, time moved differently or did not move at all. The routines continued, bells ringing at the same hours, meals served at the same times, the days indistinguishable from one another. Patients who had entered the asylum in the reign of Victoria remained there through the reign of Edward and then George. Their lives measured not by the events of the wider world, but by the small markers of institutional existence, a new superintendent, a change in ward assignment, the death of a fellow patient, the slow erosion of hope and identity. Some held on to memories of the world before, replaying them endlessly, the only possessions that could not be taken away. A childhood in the countryside, a love affair, profession once practiced, the faces of children now grown and gone. Others lost even these memories, the years of confinement erasing everything that had come before, leaving only the present tense of asylum existence. They were the truly lost. People who had become nothing but their patient status, for whom the question of who they had been before the asylum could no longer be answered. The asylum cemeteries expanded, row upon row of graves marked by numbers rather than names. Thousands buried in unconsecrated ground, their lives beginning and ending within asylum walls, the period between filled with monotony and suffering. No one mourned at these graves, no descendants visited to leave flowers or clean headstones. The asylum dead were anonymous, their stories untold, their suffering unacknowledged, except in the impersonal ledgers that recorded admission dates and death dates and nothing of the human reality between. And still the asylum would stand for decades more, monuments to Victorian certainty and Victorian failure, to the belief that madness could be systematically addressed, and the reality that such system when implemented became machinery of control and neglect. The promise had been liberation, the removal of chains and the application of science to the problem of disordered minds. The reality was new chains, medical rather than physical, but chains nonetheless, restraining not bodies alone but entire lives, condemning tens of thousands to existences that were barely life at all. The twilight deepened. The Victorian age had ended officially with the old Queen's death at century's turn, but its institutions persisted, grinding forward under their own momentum, requiring no particular vision or purpose beyond continuation. The asylum had become a permanent feature of the landscape, accepted as inevitable, questioned only by a few voices that most preferred not to hear. The patients within those walls continued their slow fade, growing old in wards that never changed, dying in beds that were immediately filled by the new patients who would follow the same trajectory toward the same end. History would eventually turn the page on the Victorian asylum. New theories and treatments would emerge. The vast institutions would close or transform, but that was future yet to come. For now, in the waning days of the old system, the asylum remained what it had become, a place where the inconvenient was sent and forgotten, where suffering was routine, where hope was dangerous luxury, and where the only certain escape was death. The candle had burned low, the chamber had fallen silent, and history once again prepared to turn the page in the dark.